I'm Dylan Edwards, and I'm a coffee expert. It is actually horrifically terrible. With these two coffees, the difference is starkly obvious. Coffee A has a really dark, glossy surface. It even smells somewhat pungent just holding it. Whereas coffee B is cinnamony in color. It sort of has a silver skin intact in each of the beans, so it's definitely a light roast. It's not necessarily a direct indication of price difference. It is a personal preference. Some people just really enjoy a dark roasted coffee versus a light roasted coffee. However, a dark roasted coffee generally is going to mask a lot of the flavors in the coffee itself, kind of like a heavy sauce. It's going to sort of just cover up all the sweetness and all the inherent characteristics of the coffee and really impart a carbony sort of smoky flavor. Whereas with a light roast, the nuances of the coffee, the flaws, the good attributes and the bad ones really do shine through. With a light roast, you're looking at more often than not a higher quality coffee. And with a dark roast, it's a little bit hard to say what the quality might be. We will, of course, brew them and taste them and then see from there. So the first thing I'm doing is just rinsing these filters. The reason behind that is a lot of paper filters will actually impart a bit of a papery flavor in your cup. So you want to really wash out some of that flavor, discard it before you brew your coffee. So you get a really clean cup of coffee. So we have our filters rinsed. We're going to grind our coffee. First thing I always do is smell them. Part of that is heat masks flavor. You don't want to drink your coffee when it's piping hot, not only to not burn your tongue, but also because it's really hard to taste. That's why if you go to a gas station when you're on a road trip and you have a really piping hot gas station cup of coffee, you could probably get half of it down without noticing it, but as it cools off and it's sitting in your cup holder, it's gonna taste awful. Coffee A is definitely got like a really molassesy texture, like almost the experience of having raw sugar on your tongue. It kind of leaves one with like an almost bittersweet kind of sweetness. The acidity is extremely muted here. What I'm getting is overall like a very velvety mouthfeel, general kind of one note. Wow. After drinking coffee A, coffee B is like drinking fruit juice. There's like clear kind of stone fruit acidity. Yeah, it almost tastes like a sweet peach kind of nectarine flavor. Probably wondering why I'm slurping really loudly. Slurping the coffee, taking some air in with your sip is actually a great way to sort of aspirate your palate and to incorporate lots of air as you're tasting. We actually taste a lot with our nasal passage. So as we're bringing air in when we're tasting, we really activate our olfactory sense and we really incorporate our sensory ability to taste. I would say that sample B is the more expensive of the two just based on the transparency and the clarity of the sweetness, whereas sample A is most likely a cheaper coffee. Let's see. Et voila. With darker roasts, the coffee itself isn't necessarily inferior. However, more often than not, the darker the roast, the less and less you can actually taste the origin character of the coffee. With coffee A, like I said, I'm not necessarily certain that the quality of the beans are inferior, but I can say that I cannot taste the origin character at all. I'm really just tasting a very caramelized, very carbonic flavor that gives me a general impression of roast flavors. Whereas sample B is a very fresh, very fruited, very clear, crisp flavor profile. It definitely tastes like a unique flavor of origin. I see a pretty stark difference between A and B. B is a fairly uniform looking bean. It has a really whole, clean kind of appearance to it. The roast is a bit lighter. All of the beans are fully intact. They're a very uniform shape and size. As sample A here, there are some very misshapen beans, some very small bits, broken bits. There are even some of these pale colored blonde pieces and beans themselves, which we refer to as Quakers, which are basically underripe coffee seeds that are picked too early. I'm going to say this is a specialty coffee and this is a commercial grade coffee just based on the appearance. Really, really bitter, almost kind of sour as well. Honestly, the aroma has kind of gone from just a roasty smell to now it almost smells like a kind of a wet newspaper. It's very bitter. I instantly want to put a lot of sugar in this coffee. This coffee is clear, it's sweet, it's a exciting coffee, has really great sweetness, it has really good flavors. This is the kind of coffee that I'd really want to just enjoy on its own black. This coffee is the kind of coffee I'd expect on most flights, and I'd really only ask for it if I was super desperate. Let's see how much they are. Wow, big difference. Needless to say, these are very different coffees. Every step behind this coffee had to have been carefully managed for this cup to be so sweet and so clear. This coffee is something that probably grew at a variety of altitudes. It's grown with out of focus. It was probably not even dried carefully or milled carefully. It probably came from a very volume-focused mill and a volume-focused roastery that was really looking to shave cost and to really just produce a drinkable caffeine beverage and not something that was really delicious. These two samples are fairly average in appearance. One of them has a slightly more developed roast. I can see that there's a little bit of oil on the surface, which is an indication that it was roasted a little bit longer. Whereas sample A does still have the silver skin intact, which is some of the cell material of the coffee seed. This is more indicative of a lighter or medium roast. However, these roasts aren't different enough that I would lump one into the bucket of dark roast and light roast. These two coffees are probably of a similar caliber. However, I imagine sample A is probably just a little bit better. We're gonna have to taste them to find out. So the first thing that I'm doing when I brew a cup of coffee is I'm gonna hit each cup with a bit of hot water, and I'm gonna look for some off-gassing to happen. It looks like one of these is already off-gassing quite a bit more than the other one. To me, that indicates a fresh roast. This coffee here is bubbling up. You can see multiple bubbles still coming up, probably 30 seconds into this brew now. This one here is just sort of sunk in. It's already sort of stopped any sort of action. It's probably a little bit more of a stale roast. So fresh roast causes bubbles. Really it causes what we call the bloom. And that is because there is gas trapped inside freshly roasted coffee. Part of the roasting process is putting the coffee through a really wide array of chemical reactions during the roast. And what happens in that roasting process is gases are physically trapped inside the bean. Slowly over time, they will leak out of the coffee bean. However, they do expediently leak out once the coffee is ground. This is one of the reasons you really want to seek out whole bean, freshly roasted coffee. It's going to be a lot more lively and sweet and vibrant when you get it and brew it at home. Sample A has like sort of a crisp, almost like apple-like acidity, really refreshing, really clear. It's actually a very sweet cup of coffee. It has sort of almost a sugary character to it. Reminds me of rooibos tea. Yeah, it's very crisp, very light, very fresh with mouth-watering acidity. The predominant note here is a very tobacco-y flavor, very kind of bitter, earthy flavors that are almost like heavy on the palate, leaving one with like a heavy kind of bitter aftertaste. Overall, it's a kind of a dull experience. That acidity that I was talking about in cup A, I'm getting almost little to none of that type of acidity at all. Really, I'm experiencing mostly a very big bodied cup of coffee, something that would definitely take a lot of milk and sugar quite well, but on its own is not a very enjoyable cup of coffee at all. Based upon what I'm tasting, I think A is definitely the more expensive coffee. It has clear, expressive flavor, vibrant acidity, good sweetness. It's very balanced. It's very crisp. Coffee B, again, is very tobacco-y, very tired, very muted in terms of its flavor. Overall, it just leaves kind of a heavy, bitter flavor on the tongue. I'm going to assume that this is a commercial-grade coffee and it is the less expensive of the two. We'll have to see. Based on these prices, I think it's fair to say this is probably a bottom of the shelf, grocery store, Best Buy coffee, whereas at $28 a pound, you're probably going to find this at your specialty coffee shop, something that's freshly roasted, in small batches. When you're looking for coffee in your grocery store, you really want to look for coffee that has a roasted on date, not a best by date. Roasted on really gives you a sense of whether that coffee's fresh. You really want to look for coffee that's no older than 2 or 3 weeks past its roast date if you want to enjoy it at its peak. Whereas coffee that has a best by date and no roasted on date will really not give you any sense of how fresh it is. That type of coffee is most likely commercial grade. It's probably cheaper, and there's a reason. We see all sorts of varieties when we're traveling the world and sourcing coffees. Varieties, just like in apples or in wine, in coffee, we also have specific types of seeds that produce specific types of plants. If you're ever at your farmer's market and you've seen the various varieties of apples available for sale, the same thing is the case with coffee. When we go to specific origins like Colombia, like Panama, like Guatemala, we will encounter specific varieties of coffee. I see 2 dishes which have very uniform beans in them. Coffee A has really elongated beans, which is an indication of a few exotic varieties that I'm aware of. The bean itself looks a lot like sort of an Eastern Ethiopian bean. A bean from Harar or a bean from even Yirgacheffe will have sort of an elongated shape like that. Whereas this bean over here has a very uniform, sort of smaller, kind of more round, oval shape. Based on the way that these coffees look, I'm going to guess that coffee A has probably a very unique variety behind it. It is most likely a geisha or a pacamara variety, something that is very unique and exotic, whereas coffee B, being kind of a dense, smaller, more compact bean, is most likely a common variety like a Bourbon or a Caturra variety. We're going to have to taste them to find out. So cup B is really fresh. It's really satisfying. It has a pretty big body. Sort of has a character of a really juicy kind of caramel soaked apple flavor, but overall also just a classic flavor. Sample A is so distinctive. It's got a really, really apricot forward kind of flavor profile. It almost tastes like an Earl Grey tea, just doused with apricot juice. Super light, super crisp. It's a really exotic and really unique cup of coffee. Based on tasting these 2 coffees, I'm fairly certain that this is a geisha or something very exotic. Maybe a variety I haven't even heard of. In any event, it has such clarity and such like pronounced, clear, distinctive, singular flavors that I would assume that it's much more expensive than this cup. This cup B, is still very sweet, very satisfying. It has tons of fresh acidity. However, the flavors on the whole are more of a caramelly, kind of classic, predictable coffee experience in comparison to cup A. Let's see what they are. Whoa. Yep, that is a rare varietal coffee at $86 a pound, and this one isn't bad either at $30 a pound. Based on the price point, I'm going to say this is most likely a geisha coffee. Geisha trees are extremely scarce in the world. The fact that this coffee is so sweet and so clean makes me think it's probably from one of the most famous farms in Panama producing geisha. However, I, of course, do not know. This coffee is fantastic too. This is the kind of coffee when you're going to splurge, when you're going to spend a weekend at home and you really just want to treat yourself, you buy a fantastic single producer lot or a great coffee from your local roaster that they're proud of. It's probably going to taste a little bit more like this and cost a bit more in this range. With these 2 coffees, it's pretty hard to tell which of them is the more expensive of the 2. Coffee A looks like it may be a single varietal lot, just based on the oblong, elongated shape of the coffee. It looks like it might be a more exotic variety. However, coffee B and coffee A are both really uniform. They have no broken bits. They have no Quakers. They really look like high quality, well-processed coffees. Both of these coffees look so high quality that I look forward to tasting them and seeing what the difference is. Both of these coffees are really good. They're both very expressive. They're both very sweet. It's hard to say which of these is the better. I think it makes sense to continue tasting them. And in fact, I'm going to break out a cupping spoon. A cupping spoon is a spoon that we use for tasting coffee professionally. And it just helps us aspirate the coffee when we slurp it. It allows us to incorporate some air and really spray that coffee all across our palate. As I'm taking a couple more sips, I'm realizing that Cup A is actually distinguishably more juicy. It's got a lot of citrus, really leaving me with a super crisp, super lasting sort of juicy flavor in my mouth. With Cup B, I'm getting a lot more sort of a general flavor profile, a more of an impression rather than a clear distilled flavor. That to me makes me think that Cup A is probably the more expensive. However, I imagine that they're probably pretty close. Let's see. So key takeaways. Cup A is most likely extremely specific, probably down to a single farm, probably maybe even down to a single varietal from a single farm, grown at a specific altitude. Whereas Cup B, more of a general flavor profile, really good, really enjoyable, but giving more of an impression and less of a singular flavor experience. That to me indicates probably something that was grown in a general region, not necessarily as expressive as Cup A, and thus probably more of like a regional lot type of coffee. The great thing about this is one can enjoy fantastic coffees that are traceable to a region, while also for a little more money, enjoy coffees that are really traceable down to a single farm and get really specific with the tasting experience. While you may not need all of this information when you're just brewing your morning cup of coffee, what I hope you will take away from this is that you can get well-roasted, freshly roasted, traceable coffee for less than $30 a pound, which is ounce for ounce better value than a good bottle of wine at your local wine shop.